Max has been an academic in the field of consciousness studies for many decades and has written many books and publications over the years. And although sort of retired now, still seems to appear in webinars and presentations all over the world. And I'm interested that tonight Max has chosen Only Connect as his title. It's one of the things that I've really treasured about Max's contribution to this community is the way he's not only connected us round contemplating all different aspects of consciousness over the last 16 years here in this forum, but because of his worldwide reputation, has been able to connect us with people from all over the world. So I'm not quite sure what aspect of Only Connect he's going to share with us tonight. But I won't say more about that. Over to you, Max.
Thank you, Wendy. So Only Connect, I love this phrase. It's of course very famous, and it comes from Howard's End, Forster's book, Howard's End. And I'll just read this, it's up there, but I'll read it anyway. Only connect, that was the whole of her sermon. Only connect, the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its height, live in fragments no longer. And Only Connect is also the central principle of yoga. So the term yoga comes from the derivative yug, which means to join, and yoke. So the question is, to what? And what I'm going to do with you is to talk a little bit about my own journey from a state of disconnection, really, to a state of greater connection. And unusually in this talk, I'm going to talk a bit about my own experiences. Normally I do academic talks and even if I try to make them palatable and so on, but I don't talk personally really. And so I'm just enjoying the opportunity to maybe do that. I'm going to give you a kind of potted history, if you like, of my journey. It'd be very brief, have to skip, I've lived a long time now, and just touch on some important things. If you're interested in knowing more about the sort of things that Wendy was talking about in terms of, my whole journey into consciousness studies and more of the intellectual bits, this book, which I contributed to a few years ago, gives an introduction, and that introduction is online and it's free. The book's terribly expensive, so I don't expect any of you to buy it. But the introduction is quite fun. But I'm going to be talking to you about some things that are not really in that introduction because it's intended for an academic audience and just general, population and whatever. And so I'm 80, and that means I was born in 1942 in Amsterdam under German occupation in the middle of the Second World War. And I'm not going to say a lot about that, but that led to a lot of turbulence in my youth. So before the age of 10, I lived on 3 continents. I had to learn 3 languages. So Dutch, French, English, and had 10 changes of primary school before secondary school, up to about the age of 10. So I lived in Holland, Belgium, New York, Sydney, and Brisbane, and mostly in Sydney. And then I went through a period of what you might call educational stability. So in spite of all that, I got into a decent school, Sydney Boys High School, and then Sydney University. And so suddenly that was all stable. But obviously that early childhood left a lot of existential fluidity. So the whole question of who am I, where do I belong, what do I believe, became very fluid, if you like, and always became, if you like, defined by the group because of the need to adjust in the moment and in the situation and so on. And that sense of me being, if you like, a kind of center of reference didn't have a really good chance to form. So, and the same goes for what guiding system of meaning or belief do I adopt about reality, about religion, about socio-cultural norms, and so on. Because, and so I quite like the metaphor, if you are in continuously shifting sands, how do you find firm ground on which to stand? And that was quite painful, actually, but later I came to view that as a kind of acute bout of the human condition. So in a sense, I think we're all in this sort of situation with so many conflicting things to believe in, or different messages, post-truth, you name it. Where can we find something solid? And particularly in times of stress, trouble, anxiety, and so on. But it left me, if I had to describe myself at this time, say in high school, I was pretty intellectual, I was at grammar school and all the rest. I was argumentative, skeptical of rigid belief systems. I didn't believe the teachers half the time, what other messages people were trying to impart onto me as to what I should believe in. And I would say in terms of spiritual matters and so on, does God exist or doesn't exist, I was firmly an agnostic. So it seemed to me at the time that the only intellectual position that an intellectual, if you like, could adopt was you could neither prove it, nor could you disprove it. Maybe he did, or she did, or it did, but I just parked the question. I didn't know. But that doesn't mean I wasn't searching. So when I went to Sydney University, as boys who are good at maths and physics are pretty good, I'd opted to study electrical engineering because I was kind of thrilled by the wonders of the American space program, and thought, well, that really would be cool, to design electronics and build the new world and so on. And but I found actually when I was doing this course that I was much more interested in reading psychology and philosophy, and particularly existential philosophy, which, given my background, wasn't particularly surprising, really. And I remember, and that slide I quite like, because that's what engineering is like, lots of mathematics. So that language wasn't the language which was natural to me, even though, I had to learn it and do it and became an engineer and so on. But I remember lying in my college room with these bare walls, because the walls were quite dilapidated, and there was just this bare light bulb above me, and thinking, is this all there is? And I had another image, for example, of being in a kind of goldfish bowl, and the fish kind of butting against the glass. It kind of knew what was inside the bowl, but it didn't know what was outside the bowl. And I had the same feeling about my senses, limiting me in a way to what was real. It just wasn't enough somehow. I couldn't contact, a deeper reality just using my tactile receptors or my eyes and, so on. Literally, it was shaped by, my consciousness was being shaped by my sensory equipment, but was also limited by it. And I graduated and started working in a big company, and was first working in an electronics laboratory and then in information technology, and was if you like, progressing up the management ladder. If I'd stayed there, I would have had a rich house somewhere in Sydney, somewhere overlooking the harbour, no doubt, as my friends all aimed to do. But for me, it was a bit meaningless. That it was made clear to all us graduates that the aim of the great company was to increase the profitability by 10% a year. And that to me didn't sound like a meaningful working life. And I started doing psychology at night. They did a full-time evening degree, as well as I was working in the day, studying psychology at night. It didn't really, psychology didn't help either, because it was all behaviorist and you know, fairly, well, quite boring tests and so on. And this sense of not finding something that I needed to find and connecting in a way that I needed to connect was very acute. And at a certain point, I just felt that I've got to leave this. I know I've got a good job and whatever. It's time to leave, start traveling the world, looking for somewhere else to live maybe, and something else to do. So, as many of my generation at the time, I took the boat to Europe, and it's quite common for Australians to do this because it's the other side of the world, far from the centers of culture. And so those days we used to go by boat. And so in 6 weeks, we traveled from Sydney to Naples. And I started hitchhiking around Europe for 3 months, guitar over one shoulder, you know, backpack with all the stuff I needed, without any idea of where I might get a job, where I might stay for a while. I had romantic ideas of maybe studying existential philosophy at the Sorbonne under Jean-Paul Sartre and perhaps Simone de Beauvoir. I actually went to the left bank and realized that all the books were in French. And although I'd done French at school, I thought that was too big an ask. And so it was inevitable that in some ways that I would wind up in England. And so I thought, well, okay, it'd be nice if I could carry on with psychology in the United Kingdom. And, you know, through circumstances which are quite fun to talk about, but I haven't got the time to do it, I wound up in Notting Hill Gate in 1966, living in a corrugated iron shed in the back of a bed-sitting property. It was a very nice shed, actually. It was a bit like a log cabin and so on. It was near to the Portobello Road. And I thought it was wonderful. I'd landed on a different planet. The place was buzzing with color and culture and yeah, it was better than living in a garret in Paris, you know, starving and doing existential philosophy in a way. And I managed to talk myself into doing what was called an MPhil qualifying examination at University of London, at Bedford College, which is now Regent's College. And that means you have to take a certain number of exams. I'd already done 2 years of psychology. I'd got an engineering degree and so on. And they picked just those bits that you're supposed to be weak on. And if you qualify, you can go on to do research in psychology and study for a PhD. While I was doing this qualifying degree, at one point, one of the students who was also doing a final year in psychology asked me whether I'd be interested in taking some LSD. Now, I'd actually come across LSD when I was traveling in Europe. I had read an article by Timothy Leary, and you've heard of that famous name. And I thought at the time that what was being reported here was so extraordinary that if it was half true, I couldn't seriously pretend to study the mind or psychology without at least having a look at it. And so when she offered, I said, okay, yeah, fine, come along to the shed. And she came along with a sugar cube with a little bit of LSD on it. And sorry? A laugh, okay. All right, so the first time I tried it, it was interesting. The world became luminous. My mind slowed down, my perception slowed down. The brightness of the sun sparkling off a spoon, the buttery taste of butter filling the whole of my mouth, and so on. It was certainly interesting. Sort of, I would describe it as cleaning the doors of perception. You know, if I misquote Huxley slightly, it wasn't yet in any way opening the doors of perception. So, yeah, nice experience, but not of any particular significance, and that was that. And then a couple of months later, she asked me again, and I thought, well, okay, try it again, see what happens. And same sugar cube, a little bit of LSD, same amount, I think. And then something completely different happened. So to begin with, the visual scene pixelated. Now, by pixelated, what I mean is it's a bit like if you have a printer, it all consists of pixels, or television screens also consist of pixels. So the visual field started to pixelate. And for reasons that I don't know, I intuitively asked myself, well, what happens if you go inside that pixel in my mind? And when I did that, if you like, as a kind of mental suggestion, then there were displays of colors and the sort of things you might get if you look at paintings or pictures of the experiences that people have with LSD and so on. And yeah, interesting, but so ask that question again. What happens if you go beyond or inside or deeper than that? And then I got more patterns, simpler ones. Again, so I asked the question again. And this time, I started moving through something that looked a bit like a neural network. And that's not a bad representation. It's something I've lifted off the web. But you know, I haven't invented it or anything like that. And so I kind of moved through that and deeper through that until eventually I emerged on what seemed to be the surface of something. And this thing appeared to me to be a timeless being, spaceless, timeless, which existed forever, which formed itself into different worlds infinitely. And I was just a little sort of cell on it, as we all were. And the precise way all the cells were grouped together on, or in this form of being, seemed to indicate, if you like, you know, families of similar beings, which tended to group in different places on this. And as I went deeper into that, and I was standing at the time, I could also switch between this vision and my body in the room, just by focusing my attention, my head seemed to be filling with light, becoming brighter and brighter. And then when I went back into it, I noticed that bright as I seemed to be, there was something way, way brighter, a kind of sun star thing, a much greater power than even this thing of which I was a part. And then I noticed that there was a beam of energy connecting this greater power to this thing of which I was a part, which was pulling it into evolution ever so slowly. And that power was the power of love. Well, when I thought about it afterwards, there were some oddities about that, which we can maybe talk about later on if you're interested in it. Why two beings rather than one, or what seemed to be two beings? It doesn't mean to say that there are two beings, but that's what it seemed like. And how could something that was eternal be an evolution? So these are deep questions we can come back to if you want. But the experience actually went on for quite a while. It went on for hours. And there were very distinctive features about it. So for a start, what I was witnessing was kind of just there. It was completely unlike anything I could have expected. It was completely unlike anything I've ever read. It wasn't even something I could imagine. And yet it was a very powerful experience. And the second feature of it, and this is quite remarkable if you've not had it, the experience seemed to be more real than what we normally think of as real. So in the same way that we make a natural judgment about dreams and images being less real than this, that state, that seemed to be more real than this, which is quite a salutary experience. It was also a non-inflationary experience. Yeah, I was having this wonderful experience, but it was part of the experience that anything about that was true for me has to be true for everybody. And then at a certain point, I found myself laughing. It was an absolute joke, something very funny about the whole thing. And it's what I would call a cosmic joke. And the joke was that here we are, I'm 80, some of you are a lot younger, some of you are big, some of you are small. And we all, are very concerned about who we are as opposed to who somebody else is. And the joke is they were all manifestations of the same thing. So if you think of a hand, it's like, this finger saying, I'm bigger than you are, and so on. But actually, we're manifestations of the same thing. And that was also a deep part of the experience. Another thing I found rather interesting about the experience because, as I said, I was the skeptical, agnostic, critical type, not, easily led into something, is that in a way, the experience at the end was completely self-negating, and it was an intuition that came from the experience that one didn't need to have such an experience to be in evolution, because all the necessary information that one needed in order to make progression in one's own being was actually there in every moment and every interaction in normal life. And it was non-addictive. I didn't do anything like that again for the next 40 years, for the whole of my academic career. So, what was I to do with it? Well, my instinct was to tell everybody, this is amazing. And obviously, who do you tell? So I remember accosting the odd person at a party and, starting to describe this experience and getting what I would describe as a rolled eye response. And I soon realized that this is not something that you can talk about. It's not something that others want to hear. Particularly if you haven't been there in some way, it's so remote. So there's not much point. A second point is a practical point. Yeah, I'd had this wonderful experience, but I was still, a foreign student living in this shed, 12,000 miles away from home, without a job. Hoping to do a PhD, with no certainty at the end that I would actually get a PhD. In those days, it was quite likely you wouldn't. And I didn't have a close personal relationship. So existentially, I was still in the same position as I was before. Yeah, I'd had this wonderful experience, but it didn't sort the existential situation. Intellectually, the other bit of me kicked in. Yeah, I wasn't going to deny I had the experience, but yeah, I'd taken a bit of LSD. To what extent was the whole thing maybe a chemical, effect on the brain? Who knows? Just a smidgen of doubt. Well, maybe more than a smidgen. And then the possible resolution for me was it then settled my determination that if I was going to do a PhD, it would probably be about consciousness. And that's what it did. So, now we get into the beginnings of my, forget the drug, forget anything different from what we normally have to deal with. Given how we normally experience the world, how can we understand consciousness? How can we understand these deeper questions? So back into the normal situation that we all share. And it occurred to me that the problem that I'd had when I was lying in my room, thinking, is this all there is? And the image of the goldfish pushing at the edges of his bowl, being restricted by sensory perception, could perhaps be altered. It was well known, even at the time, that other animals see in different frequencies, ultraviolet, for example, for bees, that bats and many other animals can hear way above where we hear. Some animals can tune into the electromagnetic field. Some fish actually can sense electrical fields that they generate in order to, which are then disturbed by other fish, and they use that to hunt the other fish in muddy waters where they can't see anything. And I thought, well, why, maybe I can research the question of why human sense organs are tuned in just the way we are. Is there a good reason? And a way of doing that might be if I could build a machine which would actually alter the range of energies that I could tune into. Theoretically, there are ways you could do it. So you could wear something like the infrared goggles that one uses in night vision and tune into those frequencies. And you also see where things have been, because you get heat traces. But I thought actually a simpler way to do it, and I remembered there was something in my electrical engineering that I remembered that I could think of a way of doubling the range of human hearing. And I won't go into the details of how I did that, but all you need is a mic that will pick up frequencies above the range of human hearing and then translate, all those frequencies down to the range where you can hear. And I built a machine, for instance, that allowed you to do that. And then what I was trying to answer as a possible PhD is why our senses are tuned in the ranges that they are. Well, that was interesting, interesting experience. I walked around Regent's Park, with this bit of machinery looked at suspiciously by policemen and so on. But there were some interesting things to hear. But by and large, the conclusion I came to was that actually our sense organs are tuned to the ranges where they normally operate, because that's where most of the sound of interest to human life really is. And I thought, well, that isn't going to get me a PhD. It's too simple. It's too obvious. And so I thought of something else I could do with the device. I actually used a configuration of it to produce a new kind of hearing aid for the deaf, and also a speech training aid for the deaf for sensory neural deafness, which doesn't respond to amplification. It's a bit like knocking out some keys on a piano. You simply drag the frequencies up there to somewhere where the keys are still working, if you like. And that became the PhD, and I did research on that for quite a while. And then when I got my PhD, I thought, well, okay, it's a bit like before you go to university. If you're in post, I have a university job, I could then choose what was I going to work on for the rest of my academic career, maybe. And I thought, well, I want to get back to consciousness. Normally, when we think about how consciousness relates to the brain and the physical world, we think of these as distinct entities. And if that's true, and we ask, what does consciousness do, then perhaps it relates to the brain's electromagnetic field, which somehow unifies the brain's activities. Given my engineering background, I thought, well, if that's the case, I could build a machine to measure it. And then I thought, maybe the function of consciousness is to actually unify perception. So the brain does all sorts of wonderful things. It produces this electromagnetic field, and the field unifies perception. And indeed, that some decades later became one standard theory of what consciousness might do. But I rejected both ideas within a few days. I'm not close to the idea that consciousness is related to the brain's electromagnetic field, but the notion that consciousness just is an electromagnetic field somehow completely fails to capture the feeling quality of the experience. That's just not described in the physics. And the notion that consciousness organizes what the brain is doing seemed a bit odd, because I wasn't even conscious of having a brain, let alone, what the neurons look like. And so the notion that my consciousness was somehow unifying everything that was my brain was doing required me to accept the idea that consciousness was doing this unconsciously, which doesn't make sense. And then I thought, actually, there's something even odder about the way I'm thinking about all this. I was thinking about it in the way we nearly all think about it. So here we have a clear separation between three things. So this is the physical world out here, and the light rays travel from the physical world, and here's a perceiver, and something happens, represents the physical world and the occipital regions of the brain, and then something happens in the brain which supports a conscious experience, and then you have a conscious experience. So three things. And what's interesting about this typical way of thinking about things is that it splits consciousness from the physical world. So everything above that green line is, if you like, the experience, and everything below that line is physical. You know, the cat's physical, the head's physical, the brain's physical, and so on. That's one split. And there's another split as well. It splits what's out there from what's in here. So, and that's the way we normally operate. I'm over here, you're over there. And you know, what I'm experiencing is subjective to me, and everything out there is objective. It's part of the physical world. And it was also the case that within, if you like, the field, the emerging field of consciousness study, the workers about all that typically did this with it. They actually said, yeah, we accept that this is here, the head's over there. It seems to be the case that we have an experience which isn't either of those two things, but science will eventually show that the cat in the cloud, if you like, is nothing more than a state of the brain. That's called materialist reductionism. And that's really, this has been an ancient debate. But what struck me about all this is that there was something fundamentally wrong with the picture and with my own assumptions about consciousness. So if I actually am honest about my visual experience as I look out at the room, the only visual experience I have of what's out there in the room is you out there in the room. I literally do not have any experience of you in here, up there. It actually doesn't exist. And the same applies to you. If you're looking at me, ask yourself, where is my visual experience of Max? Is there any visual experience you're having other than this waving thing out here in space? And that applies to everything. So there's something wrong in the debate and the configuration of, you know, the elements that people are trying to make sense of right from the off. And it's also worth noting that even that reductionist model is split. It splits the stuff in the world from me. That out there's got nothing to do with me, according to this model. But that is closer to the actual situation. So what's actually going on is, for me, well, for you, let's talk about you. So there really is something out here waving its arms about, yeah? And you really are experiencing this something out here. The way you see me has as much to do with you as it has to do with me. So if you didn't have color vision, I wouldn't be colored. If you didn't have shape perception, I wouldn't have the shapes that I have. And there's a whole apparatus of sensory processing unique to us, but also shared, which produces this experience out there. We can come back to that. This is one of the hardest points to grasp for people who haven't actually become familiar with that. If what I'm saying is true, that somehow something going on in my brain or your brain produces something that we normally experience to be out there in the world, then there's a mechanism which I call perceptual projection. So these arrows, they don't mean that something's physical coming out of the brain. It's part of the psychology of what's going on. Is a process which is an empirically observable effect. Same goes if you just touch your fingers together and you feel a pressure on, and you just do it. You feel the pressure, and I'll ask you, where's the sensation of pressure? Yeah? And I'm not going to say anything mysterious if I say, look, it's at the fingertips. And then you think of what's going on. Well, there's compression of the sensory end organs to do with tactile perception. Neural signals travel up to the somatosensory cortex, and you get activation in the somatosensory cortex, but you don't feel the sensation up there. You feel it down there. It's the same effect. And this is an easy way to see it. This is virtual reality. So in this case, there really isn't a cat out there in the world, but everything being presented on these goggles corresponds to the information which would be transmitted to the two eyes from a real cat out there in the world. And because all the information arriving at the brain is the same, the brain interprets it the same way and sees something out there in the world. And so there is a sense in which one can think of what one normally experiences as a form of virtual reality, except that in this case, it isn't just virtual, but it corresponds in some way to something that's actually there. And if you go a bit further with that, it's not just what's out there that is part of this projection, if you like, but my actual body as well, and my sense of being in a room. So to put it another way, there's a field of energy and information in which we're immersed, in which we are distinct configurations of energy and information. And there's an unconscious interaction between what's out there in the world, or what's in my body and so on, and my perceptual systems, which I'm unaware of, which results in a model of what's going on. So what's all around us, if you like, configures itself through us into a view of itself. Yeah, I'm trying to take you very quickly through, intuitively, without the time to justify it for you in any depth, but very happy to go back to it later on. But there's a fundamental shift required by this, that actually conscious experience, and the hard problem of consciousness requires one to think that consciousness is somehow completely separate from what we normally think of as the physical world. But actually, that's nonsense. That the physical world or what we normally call the physical world, is actually the world we experience. It's the world as experienced. It's not the same as the world as described by physics. So, we're not talking about molecules, atoms, we're not experiencing those at the moment. We're experiencing people, colored, shaped, sitting in the room. I'm experiencing my body that way, and so on. And so, actually, what we normally think of as physical is part of conscious experience, not apart from it. And that's the first step towards reflexive monism, which is a kind of position that I developed over many years. So basically, within this way of looking at things, the phenomenal world, that is the world as we normally experience it, can be thought of as a biologically useful representation of what the world is like, although it isn't the world as described by modern physics, and it isn't the thing itself. And that philosophically supports a kind of indirect realism. I'm not saying all this is illusion. I'm saying it isn't all there is, and that there's a deep process, unconscious to us, working through us, which produces this view of us and each other. Well, then once you make that step, and part of the reason it's very difficult to understand what I'm saying if I just land you with it, is you have to shift your whole conceptual system to a range of connected questions. I'll just read them quickly. You know, how then does conscious experience relate to the world described by physics? Natural question. How do you make sense in this way of looking at things of subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and objectivity? How does consciousness relate to the brain? Same old question. And then how does consciousness relate to the mind? They're not the same, and particularly to the unconscious mind. So my unconscious mind is operating in order to produce this experience I'm having, if you like. How can one explain causal interactions between consciousness, mind, body, and brain? The whole business of mind, body, medicine, for example, you know, still needs to be sorted out. How does consciousness evolve? And then the question, what kind of universal initial conditions could in principle produce both this, an apparently stable physical world, and our ability to experience it in the way that we do? It's a very deep question. And basically, all of this was addressed in my book, Understanding Consciousness. So if any of this is of any interest to you, that's the best one place to go to. This is the second edition of that book. But I really want to get back to the kind of mystical stuff and my own journey and so on. And one way of doing this is to talk about the iceberg metaphor of the nature of mind, which is quite common in psychology, actually. And basically, that picture is a view of the mind, if you like, and a view of consciousness. And consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg up there. And it's only the tip, you know, of what's going on that's actually part of our normal experience. And most of what's going on, like an iceberg, remains unseen below the water, including pre-conscious processes and then unconscious processes, and then possibly transpersonal unconscious processes, and going even deeper than that. And what's really important in this picture is that the whole of it is embedded in a sea. And in this way of looking at things, our minds and our conscious experiences are embedded, if you like, in the ground of being, the ultimate ground of being, the sea. And our emanations of this, as well as being supported by it. In fact, we couldn't exist without, if you like, this grounding reality which supports us. And of course, in this model of how you think about things, there never was a separation between what we normally think of as ourselves and all the rest, although it's unconscious. And that actually means that you have to start thinking about the self in a different way. So we normally think of ourselves as being individualized conscious selves. But as I've just said, the different facets of our experienced conscious selves are generated by and represent deeper aspects of our own pre-conscious minds. And if you're thinking, well, who am I, though? Then according to this way of looking at things, so we're the whole thing, even though we identify with just the tip. And so actually, psychologically, this shifts one's sense of gravity. So once it starts to become a sort of a feeling, if you like, and the kind of attunement, if you like, to if you like, processes or things emerging from one's deeper nature. And one starts to trust some of that. There's a sense of a deeper connection to the ground of one's own being. And then, what are the boundaries of the self? Are they, just the personal bits or the transpersonal bits, or limited by the surface of the body? Or does the self really extend into the whole of the world and the supporting universe? And to what extent do our deeper selves actually connect with all the other selves of others? And within this system of philosophy and psychology, if you like, those become open questions. They're not closed questions. One's opening one's framework for exploration, if you like. And then you get, to the ultimate kind of question, the search for the ground of being. And I love this phrase. This is actually, of course, from the Bible. That in our efforts to comprehend the ground of being, we are, so to speak, attempting to see through a glass darkly. It's a wonderful phrase. But that doesn't make the ground of being unknowable. And actually there are three routes that, science and philosophy and individually one can search, one can approach it. Physics, you can arguably say that that's exactly what physics is trying to do. What is the ground of being viewed from the perspective of physics? And what is the ultimate constituent of the universe and so on? And what would a grand unifying theory be like? You can try to do it through actually finding different frameworks for thinking about all this, which is, of course, what I'm trying to do here. And provided that, in the end, you wind up with both an account of, all the ordinary things you want to know, but also some of the extraordinary things you might like to understand a bit better as well. And then, of course, there are multiple ways that one can explore this through various forms of first-person exploration. And here we get into the whole business of all the meditative practices, the Eastern psychologies and philosophies, as well as the Western ones, and mystical experiences of many kinds. All of which, arguably, are views of a particular kind into the ground of being. And in my last work, last published work is the Universe Conscious, Reflexive Monism and the Ground of Being. I go into these kinds of questions. That's also online if you want to look at it. And in the end, what I developed was what's known as a form of cosmopsychism, actually usefully from my point of view, as opposed to, not being able to say anything about these things. Within modern philosophy in the last 5 years, cosmopsychism has become a respectable position within philosophy of mind. And as one way of dealing with otherwise insoluble problems of consciousness. I could talk about that later if you want to or not. And in any way, the notion that there might be, if you like, an informationally integrated conscious cosmos is supported in certain ways, at least the integrated part is, not necessarily the conscious bit, by recent developments in physics. So quantum mechanics, quantum electrodynamics, string theory, holographic theories of the universe, all tend to go in that direction into, if you like, interconnectedness at the micro level within physics. And then there are, of course, many, many first-person forms of exploration which tend to go in the same direction, that the primordial cosmos is unified and conscious. And William James, for example, who experimented with, well, in his case, with nitrous oxide all those years ago, and his friends also did. And there was something common about their experiences. And as he says, looking back on my own experiences, they all converge towards a kind of insight to which I cannot help ascribing some metaphysical significance. the keynote of it is invariably a reconciliation. It is as if the opposites of the world, whose contradictoriness and conflict make all our difficulties and troubles, were melted into unity. So this unitive mystical experience is symptomatic of it. And coming back to this iceberg model, one can think of it as, although we normally identify with that, and we only have a sense of that, which is below the water, that doesn't mean that because it's unconscious to us, it doesn't follow that it's unconscious to itself. And so one way of looking at individual self-realization may be thought of as a form of extending one's conscious light down into the ground of being, and therefore making it subjectively real and in a sense being enlightened in that sense. And then finally I get to, if you like, the position that I've been developing, for many decades. And if I had to put it in a nutshell, reflexive monism, in this vision, there's one universe, the thing itself, with relatively differentiated parts in the form of conscious beings like ourselves, each with a unique conscious view of the larger universe of which it is a part. Insofar as we are parts of the universe that in turn experience the larger universe, we participate in a reflexive process whereby the universe experiences itself. And that would be an ultimate form of holism within which all things and sentient beings interconnect. And that's where we have to leave it for now.